Speaker today is Rowan Simpson. Rowan is the chair of Hoku Group, which includes the Hoku Foundation, a non-profit investing in youth employability, social housing and waste reduction projects. He is the founder of and early investor in many high-growth technology businesses, including TradeMe, Xero, Timely and Vend, and continues to be actively involved in many other early-stage ventures. A science graduate of Victoria University of Wellington, Rowan is a lifetime sports fan and weekend warrior. In February, he completed his first and apparently last coast to coast. He lives and works remotely from a Feijoa orchard near Motueka. He is living the dream and he is with us today. Please welcome Rowan Simpson.
Thanks, Jenny May. I'm a bit nervous after that introduction, actually, that some of you may think I have answers for you today. Mostly what I have for you this morning is questions. And I realize that for many of you in the room, technology is a source of anxiety, not excitement. Some of you may even consider technology to be the enemy. So my goal today is to try and give you some better questions to ask about technology and how it could be applied in your own organization or team. So let's start with a very simple one. What is technology? Anybody brave enough to shout early in the morning? It might seem like a simple question. This is my favorite answer from Alan Kay, who's one of the legends of computer science. He said, technology is anything that was invented after you were born. Everything else is just stuff. So this morning I want to put the emphasis on the stuff we already have, on the stuff we already use. Some of it you might not even consider to be technology anymore. There's another definition. Technology is everything that doesn't work yet. When we talk and think about technology, it's very tempting to get carried away in the future and talk about all of the things that don't exist yet, or at least don't quite work yet. You say in the sector that your focus is rangatahi. Young people, there's an important distinction here, right? They're young. They were born more recently. So their definition of what is technology and what is stuff is quite different from yours and mine. So we're going to channel Matariki a little bit today, as Jenny May said. I'm going to start this talk by looking back over the last 20 or so years and some of the dominant business models that have emerged during that time. And then we'll talk briefly at the end about the next wave. So let's talk about the three tidal waves that have washed over us all in the last 20 years. Smartphones, social media, and localization or personalized media. Well, first we'll start with the most important trend of all, mobile phones. The mobile revolution started really in January 2007 when Steve Jobs and Apple launched the first version of the iPhone. Look at it, it's tiny. The clean out that this technology has caused has been so thorough, it's actually quite hard to remember what came before it, what the state of the art was like before that. So let's rewind to March 2006, the month that TradeMe was sold. This is the Nokia 3210 that I used every day then. Feels a little bit like looking at ancient tools in a museum display case, right? Nokia was one of the companies that used to dominate along with others like Motorola and Ericsson. Now all three of those brands are owned by other tech companies. Some of you may have been lucky enough to have one of these. Research in Motion, the company that invented the BlackBerry, is now no longer making phones. The brand is owned by TCL, a Chinese electronics firm. Arguably, this has been the most successful technology ever. In the past, things like washing machines, cars, telephones, they all took about 20 or 30 years to get to 80% adoption. Smartphones have done that in half the time. And they obliterated the technology that preceded them. By 2019, fewer than 50% of US households still had a landline. What about here in New Zealand? By June 2023, there were fewer than 70,000 residential voice-only phone connections remaining in the country. And that's down about 24% in just that year. And meanwhile, there's about 5.9 million mobile connections, more than one per person. Between us, we spend just shy of $3 billion every year on those connections. And that doesn't count the cost of the devices themselves. 43% of that, by the way, is prepaid. Or we could look at usage. So TradeMe numbers are a pretty good proxy in New Zealand for that. Nearly 60% of the traffic to TradeMe now is through mobile phones. That's up from about 30% in 2018. So it's doubled in that time. This is how people, especially young people, are choosing to use technology. In the school census in 2023, they reported that 69% of Year 9 students have their own cell phone. And that number increases to 98% by Year 11. That's third form and fifth form, for those of you still counting school years using the imperial system. There's been a lot of debate about phones in schools. These politicians have recently banned phones in schools. Not in Parliament yet, but in schools. But this hand-wringing about technology is actually not that new. This was the state-of-the-art technology when I was in Year 11. The Casio FX82 Super fractions, it could do fractions. Our teachers used to worry about the technology gap that these calculators caused. They were banned from exams. We had to do fractions the way that God intended, with a pen and paper. Go back a couple of years earlier than that, and when I was in Year 9, this technology was on the stationery list. Used to be technology, right? Then it became stuff. This is a global trend. If anything, it's actually more evident in the developing world. This is a photo I took in Rwanda. In Africa now, even the statues have their own mobile phones. In the heyday of Microsoft in the 80s and the 90s, the late 1900s as my kids like to call it, Bill Gates used to talk about his dream of having a computer in every house. Now we have a much more powerful computer in every pocket. 75% of adults on the planet have a smartphone, so what do we do with it? The answer is we do everything with it. The last time we spent more time watching television than using our phones was in 2018. Screen time stats are now blended. They no longer split those two things out because these new devices have completely changed the way we all consume television. The combined numbers get pretty big too. Between us, on average, we spend about 6 hours and 58 minutes every day looking at a screen of one kind or another. Some New Zealand stats from New Zealand On Air. In 2014, 80% of the population 15 years and older watched broadcast television, and that's now dropped to 50%. Even that number is skewed by age. Still over 75% for those 60 and older, but only 30% for those 15 to 39. Meanwhile, in the same time frame, online video reach has increased from 30% to 68% of the population. My favorite question from the survey, actually, is when people were asked to name their favorite channel. 34% of people said TVNZ. 44% of people said YouTube. So let's talk about the phones themselves. What is a phone? If we think about it, the name's kind of a bit silly. When Steve Jobs first launched the iPhone, he talked about the iPhone being a combination of 3 devices. An iPod, for those of you who remember those, a mobile phone, and what he called an internet communication device, what we might call a web browser. Fast forward to today, and the reality is for most people, phone is the least used app on their phone. The ability to make calls is not actually that interesting. There's 3 things that I think do make these devices remarkable though, so let's quickly go through those. The first is the screen. We talk about screen time, but what about the screen itself? If you look at a phone from the outside, it's nearly all screen. We'll talk about that little notch in the top in a second. But this is how we interact with these devices. It's personal, much more personal than personal computers ever were. It's tactile, it's direct, it's intimate. We touch them. And it's intuitive, right? If you hand one of these devices to a baby, they know what to do with it. They touch it. These screens have gotten so much better since 2007 as well. This is how many pixels were on the original iPhone screen compared to the screens that we all have in our pockets today. The screen is our interface to the world. Second thing that makes these remarkable is the camera. This has enabled a whole new layer of applications, including image recognition, video chat, augmented reality, not to mention selfies. It's more of an ussie than a selfie, but we'll get it. In just a few years, this has completely changed the way that we all behave when we're together. How many of you are holding your phone in your hand right now? If I asked you to turn it off completely, not just on silent, how anxious would that make you feel? If your phone buzzes while I'm speaking this morning, will you pick it up and look at it? And if so, what does that say about your priorities? The third thing are the sensors, the notch. The sensors are what actually make these devices really different from the computers that came before them. They're no longer just processing text and numbers. They're now aware of the world. So some examples, they included GPS, an accelerometer, a barometer, and a gyroscope. So they're aware of their position in the world and their movement within it. They include a proximity sensor, so they can tell when they're being held to your face, or they can tell how far from your face they're being held. They can identify us using thumbprints or facial scans, so they know that you are you. And they include an RFID chip, so they're effectively a secure credit card, or all the other kinds of cards that you used to carry separately in your pocket, transport cards, hotel keys. And they have a microphone, so they can hear your voice, and they can hear the world around them. Not in the notch, actually, but tucked away at the bottom is also a moisture sensor, so they can tell whether you're telling the truth when you take your phone in for a service after you accidentally dropped it in the bath. The enabler of all of this is the miniaturization of electronics and the huge economies of scale in hardware due to how many of these devices are now manufactured every year. This is the A16 Bionic chip in the latest iPhones to give you a sense of scale. You may have heard of Moore's Law. This graph goes all the way back to the early 70s when those chips contained about 100,000 transistors, all the way through to today when they contain tens of billions of transistors. And it looks like there's been constant and steady progress through that time. But that's a logarithmic scale. If we plot that on a normal scale, you can see the phenomenal growth that's happened since the launch of smartphones in the early 2000s. And the impact of this is way beyond just phones. If we think about it, an Alexa is really just a smartphone with no screen, but with a much better microphone and speaker. Smart watches are really just small smartphones that we wear on our wrists. And they include extra sensors, including sensors that can track our heart rate. So the latest smartwatches can now do an EKG. They can tell when you're about to have a heart attack. Or they can dial 111 for you automatically when they detect that you've fallen or crashed on your bike, for example, hypothetically. All professional rugby players have GPS sewn into their rugby jersey now. Sorry, this should have come with a trigger warning. But our high-performance cyclists and rowers, amongst others, all use data loggers to track their performance in real time and collect the training data from that. And all of these devices are using that same kind of hardware, miniature computer chips. Phones have made all of that an order of magnitude cheaper. However, we're at past peak smartphone. The number of new smartphones sold peaked out in about 2018 and has been declining since then. Maybe you think your phone is technology, but to younger people, mobile phones are definitely stuff. All technology actually follows that same S-curve that we showed on that previous graph. When we get to the flat part of the graph at the top, we stop talking about the thing and tend to start talking about the platform or the things that can be built using that thing. So that leads us quite nicely to the second tidal wave, social media. The social revolution started a few years earlier, actually, in February 2024, with the launch of the Facebook, as it was then called. This was not the first social network. Some of you may remember sites like MySpace or Friendster. Well, this one that I had a small hand in building in the very early 2000s, Old Friends, which was our shameless copy of a UK site called Friends Reunited. But Facebook is definitely the defining social network. Certainly the most used. In 2023, they topped 3 billion monthly active users for the first time. So I think you can honestly say a company has become dominant when you can compare the number of people using their service to the global population. And the company behind this, by the way, has also gotten very large, tens of thousands of employees. We'll come back to that later, although you might note the 19,000 people they laid off in 2023. Globally, social networks have achieved massive scale. So the top 6 on this list all count their monthly active users in the billions. To understand Facebook's dominance, you need to realize that 1, 3, 4, and 7 on this list are all owned by Facebook. All of these services have one thing in common. They're all platforms where people can publish and share their own content. So let's look quickly at one of the fastest growing ones on this list, TikTok. Actually, it's also on the list twice. Douyin, in 9th place, is the Chinese version of TikTok. Actually, it's the other way around. TikTok is the non-Chinese version of Douyin. Douyin makes it to 9th place on this list, even though it's really only used in one country. TikTok, for anybody living under a stone, is a platform which hosts user-submitted videos, which can range in time anywhere from 3 seconds to 10 minutes. And it's become so popular that many of the other networks on that list have had to copy the features. So Instagram with Instagram Stories and YouTube with YouTube Shorts, for example. TikTok has grown from about 500 million monthly active users in 2019 to over 1.6 billion today. Instagram might disagree with me, but I would argue TikTok is the first truly mobile social network. In addition to counting the number of people that use these things, we can also look at the amount of time people spend using these things. A service that many of you may not have heard of is Twitch, now owned by Amazon. They're the company that pioneered personal video streaming. So they are a network where anybody can host or watch live or delayed video streamed by other users on the network. Predominantly, people playing computer games. So I have a fun story about this, actually. My father, when he was still with us, was watching my son use Twitch one morning, and it was frustrating him. He said, "Why don't you actually play your own games rather than watching other people play games?" And Kieran, to his credit, snapped back immediately. "Granddad, you just spent all morning watching golf on Sky." Whatever you think of this, usage has exploded. Watching people play computer games is now a bigger business than ESPN. Some numbers on this that blew me away when I first saw them. Number of people who watch each of the major leagues in the US. American football, basketball, baseball, and ice hockey are the 4 big ones. Esports have already passed the baseball and ice hockey and is closing in on the NBA and NFL. But these numbers are from 2017. So fast forward another 7 years. And they also don't include Asia. To put that in perspective, the Rugby World Cup final 2023, by some accounts, estimated a global audience of about 94 million people. Another thing from 2017 is the launch of Fortnite, a very popular online game. Within a couple of years, they had 300 million active users. It's over 400 million now. You might not count this sort of game as a social network, but consider that a key element of the gameplay is the live chat and the collaboration between people who are playing together at the same time. Another example, my favorite social network actually, the Strava app. So this is an app where you can log your runs and rides and workouts. And again, it doesn't present on the surface as a social network, but actually social features are woven into the product at all layers. feedback, leaderboards, achievements, and group challenges. They use the GPS data that you share with them to connect you with other people who are running and riding at the same time as you. And the net result is delightful. It's an encouraging and supportive network of people who are into the same things as you. And an impact for many of you in the room today. This is the only sports club that I currently pay to belong to. People are using this all over the world. This is a heat map showing where people have logged Strava activities recently. You can see that New Zealand is pretty well lit up there. Some US soldiers in Afghanistan a while back got into some trouble when the runs that they had posted to Strava inadvertently disclosed the secret location of their base. There's a growing negative sentiment about social networks, right? The biggest concern, especially amongst older people, is privacy. And actually, I think there are worse things to be worried about. This is a quote from Brian Eno. The great promise of the internet was that more information would automatically yield better decisions. The great disappointment is that it actually yields more possibilities to confirm what you already believed anyway. So let's see a quick show of hands. I want to put you on the spot here. No fence sitting, please. Social networks good or bad? Good? Bad? Okay, interesting. You're all right, by the way. These platforms amplify the good and the bad. They're amazing platforms for self-expression and self-identity and community building. Many of you will use them to build your own communities. And at the same time, they have terrible negative impacts in terms of anxiety and body image. They're a great platform for bullies. And they even seem to massively negatively impact sleep. Whatever you think of social media, you can't deny that they're an amazing way to spread messages very quickly. And they let anybody do that. Increasingly, they set the agenda for mainstream media. Some of you may remember the red peak flag from the flag referendum a few years back. 15% of New Zealanders voted for that, even though it wasn't even included in the shortlist 6 weeks before the vote. It's a great example of an idea spread almost exclusively on social media, at least initially. However, we're also past peak social media, or at least we seem to have found the ceiling. It seems the limit for all of us is about 2.5 hours per day on average. That hasn't actually increased since about 2019. I think we might need to come up with a new name for old media, just like we did with snail mail. Because increasingly social media is media, especially to a younger audience. The third tidal wave. This one's a bit harder to point at. We have to go back even further than those other two revolutions to the 50s and 60s and the dawn of marketing, the Mad Men era. The idea is that the more specifically you can define your target market, the easier it is to reach them. And technology lets everybody do that much more effectively. TradeMe is a great example of this. In 2001, we effectively became the North Korea of global auction sites when we banned international users to try and increase trust and safety on the site. We baked in a lot of features designed to take advantage of localization. Sales were limited to New Zealand dollars. We insisted on local payment and delivery. We added local categories, and we really leveraged the 2 degrees of separation that exists between New Zealanders. We added a lot of local verticals, so motors, property, jobs, and lots of others subsequently. In other countries, by the way, those are all separate, successful, standalone businesses, but TradeMe includes them all under one. And it's the same pattern repeated with other apps, like Grab, for example, a very popular app in Southeast Asia, which includes seemingly disparate things like ride-sharing, payments, grocery delivery, couriers, hotels, and events, all under a single app umbrella targeted at a specific local audience. Or we could go to the complete opposite ends of the spectrum. So apps like Uber, a global service which is replacing fragmented and in many cases inefficient local services with significantly better user experiences. We shouldn't take these sorts of services for granted. Apps like Uber are very popular, but they're not available everywhere, definitely not in Nelson, for example. Apps like Grab are very broad, but very limited to a specific geography. They don't operate in New Zealand. So especially in small markets like New Zealand, this can create issues. So all three of those big trends are now kind of mature. I think what makes them really interesting, maybe scary, is when we combine them and think about how they interact. What's at the intersection of those three things? For example, those GPS chips in all of our mobile devices significantly increase the amount of personal data that social networks can collect. And that leads to a massive increase in their ability to target people very specifically. Some substantial businesses have been built on the back of these trends, which is a nice segue to the second part of this talk, business models. So, another question for you. What's a technology company? It's actually a really hard question to answer in detail. My answer to this is every company is or should be a technology company. Every organization is or should be a technology organization. If you disagree, then realize or try to answer which organization isn't impacted and potentially disrupted by technology. It's an idea maybe best summarized by the simple Mark Andreessen quote. Mark Andreessen is one of the inventors of the web browser. The idea, basically, is that anything that can be disrupted by software likely has been, or at least soon will be, disrupted by software. This pattern is repeated everywhere, and it's created some really massive companies. It's also destroyed some massive companies. For example, Kodak went from being a globally dominant business, one of the headline sponsors of the Olympics, to no longer in business. Completely disrupted by technology and smartphones, and by social networks like Instagram. The easiest way to understand this is that every app on your phone used to be a separate physical thing. Your camera, your calendar, your address book, maps, books, music, your wallet, and all the cards in it, television, radio, and many other things, your alarm clock, your newspaper, your calculator. They've all been replaced by software. Certainly technology has eaten the stock market. 7 out of the 8 largest companies in the world now are tech companies. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, as well as NVIDIA and TSMC from Taiwan, who make those chips that I showed earlier. Between them, those 7 companies earn more than twice New Zealand's GDP per year. This is very different from the 80s and 90s, when tech companies like IBM and Microsoft and Intel were predominantly selling technology to businesses. These companies now sell technology to everybody, to all of us. We're all customers. Newer tech companies are growing their revenue even faster. TikTok now counts their revenues, quarterly revenues, in the billions of dollars. But even more staggering to me is the way that they've grown their revenue per user every year. So how many of you have revenue of over $100 per person that you work with in your organization? These companies make a lot of money, and part of the reason for that is the wide reach of mobile devices, the fact that we all have those in our pocket. But another important part is the business models that they use. So let's look at some of those. The most prominent business model is companies that are selling our attention, or intention increasingly, to advertisers. Ad-supported content as an idea is nothing especially new. Broadcast television and newspapers have been using that business model for many decades. But what is new is the scale and quality of that targeting. It's now possible to target ads very specifically at people based on demographics, based on all of the information that you've given those networks, either explicitly, the things that you've told them about you, or implicitly, the things that they've observed based on what you clicked on, or what you watched, or what you said. The holy grail of marketing now is finding the right things to target, ideally something very specific that lots of people are looking for and nobody is currently servicing. Being very good at that is really all about data. The biggest companies in the world used to be oil companies. There's still one of those left in the top 10 in Saudi Arabia. But now the biggest companies predominantly are all effectively data companies. For companies, the data they collect about us is extremely valuable to them. If we think about it, Google, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, their product is us. That's what they're selling. We might say that we care about privacy, but what we do doesn't typically reflect that. We're generally happy to give away data, explicitly or implicitly, in return for free services, a free email account or a free social network account. And that's especially true of younger people. So it's worth pausing and acknowledging that there's really only two industries that talk about users rather than customers. Tech companies and drug dealers. Addiction is real, right? And you could cynically say addiction is the goal for these companies. They're large teams, those tens of thousands of people working at Facebook that I showed on that graph earlier, of very, very smart people working quite hard to make these apps more addictive, to try and encourage you to spend more time using their service so that they can sell more ads as a result. And nearly everything struggles to compete with the dopamine hit we all get from these devices and these networks, from notifications, from likes, from highly targeted content that's been served to us by tuned algorithms. It's a real mismatch here, right? Most people who use technology, most of us, are not savvy users. We just want to talk to our friends, or track our runs, or share some photos. But behind the scenes, these companies are making a lot of money by collecting and selling that data. It's a challenge for governments, how to rebalance that, which really means, in essence, how to match the competence of these tech companies. The worm is turning a little on this. In fact, all of the major platforms now provide tools to help users regulate their usage. Apple, Google, Facebook, YouTube all have these kinds of tools, but they can't make people want to regulate their usage. Meanwhile, more and more money is spent on advertising on these networks, on these digital platforms, including by governments, reflecting the time that we will spend on these devices. So think about how you and the sector in general spend your marketing budgets. Where's your advertising? Is it still predominantly on traditional broadcast media? Or is it on the new social networks? How well is it targeted? Are you funding the world that you want to exist? Another popular business model for tech companies, and again, there's nothing new about subscriptions. Anybody who's belonged to a gym is familiar with this model. Technical people like to draw confusing images and use terminology like SaaS or the cloud. So it's just sort of cut through some of that. It really just means software that's delivered online and sold on subscription on a monthly payment. This model's been really widely adopted by software companies, like Xero, for example, locally, replacing the upfront purchase of software. Just like software is eating the world, subscription services are eating the world too. Anything that can be sold on subscription likely will be now. So razor blades, underwear, toothbrushes, cosmetics, all of those things are now available for a monthly fee. And again, at the core of all of this is data. These services collect as much information as they can about their customers and customize their products based on that. Netflix can spend billions of dollars commissioning original programming based on the knowledge of all of our viewing habits. They pay attention to what we watch, and they can confidently extrapolate from that They don't have to listen to what we say we might watch. Even computer servers themselves have been disrupted by subscriptions, so-called platforms as a service, like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud. Many of you may use these services in your organizations. So Xero is a SaaS company, but itself, it doesn't own computer servers. It rents them. Tech companies get this. They prefer to rent these services. It's OpEx. Other organizations still often think of technology as a capital investment, something that needs to be purchased once in advance. Third popular business model is marketplaces. We're stretching the definition of technology here a little bit. Some of the most profitable tech businesses are just platforms connecting buyers and sellers, like TradeMe, creating a marketplace. So the world's biggest accommodation provider, Airbnb, doesn't own any beds. Similar story with Uber, Etsy, Kickstarter, lots of other marketplaces. TradeMe is a platform that sells hundreds of millions of dollars of products every year and takes a commission on those sales, but holds no stock and has no responsibility for fulfillment. When these marketplaces get large, there tends to be one big winner. And there's a simple reason for this. Buyers want to be in the marketplace where sellers are, and sellers want to be in the marketplace where buyers are. So this network effect creates a winner-takes-all dynamic. And increasingly that's true globally. Even for local services, it's no longer safe to assume that the suppliers are also local suppliers. These marketplaces are built on the back of their reputation system, like TradeMe's feedback. So we tell kids, for example, don't ride with strangers. That's literally Uber's product. The reality is, though, that it's safe, right? Statistically, probably safer than traditional taxis. And there's a reason for that. We rate every ride, and bad actors get found out pretty quickly. The difficult reality, though, is in a perfect marketplace, the winner is the seller who values their time the lowest. And that's caused a big change in job security. On these platforms, reputation is really hard-earned but quickly lost. And sellers' margins get squeezed as a result. So we're moving now well beyond technology to the impact that technology and these networks have on people and on society. So here's an awkward question for you. Are you building a platform, or are you busking on somebody else's platform? In a New Zealand context, are you selling milk solids or chocolates? So we'll finish up briefly looking ahead. Tech people like me love to talk about the future, love to talk about what's coming next. But remember, technology is everything that doesn't work yet. So over the next couple of days, you might hear about some of these things: virtual reality, augmented reality, machine learning or AI, autonomous vehicles, blockchain, crypto, maybe even robots. The important thing to keep in mind about all of these things on this list is that none of them have had their aha moment yet. They might not. Time will tell. We're still in the investment phase in all of these areas. Lots of venture capital is being burned chasing winners in each of these categories. But so far, there's no obvious equivalence of Apple for mobile phones, or Facebook for social networks, or Google for targeted advertising. The closest we have so far are NVIDIA and TSMC, the companies making the chips, not the companies making the apps. So we're still building the platform. It's not clear yet whether those platforms will float. So while those three tidal waves I talked about have all washed over us and have now reached maturity, we have all the devices we need. We already spend as much time as we physically can on these networks. The next wave hasn't quite broken yet. We're kind of in this lull between waves. So if you're worried about that list of new technologies, I would say be more worried about stuff. Be more worried about the things that already exist and that are already being used. Are you using those things as well as you could? Because honestly, if you don't have your strategy sorted around smartphones and social networks and targeted advertising, worrying about AI or robotics is a bit like the person who decides they need to lose weight and starts by stressing about the nutribiotic content of their diet, but still eats McDonald's for lunch a couple of times a week. You have to do the obvious things first, with the technology that we already have, with stuff, and then worry about what the future might hold. Here's a great question for you to all ask about your own organizations. What data do you have? How are you storing it? How are you collecting it? What are the patterns in that data that could be interesting or useful? How are you using it at the moment? What are the opportunities there? So to sum up, mobile phones, social networks, targeted advertising, these are three related revolutions that have changed the world. They're now mature and almost ubiquitous. They're not technology, especially not to a younger audience. They're just stuff. And if we're not already engaging in all of those areas, we're missing in action, really. Technology is eating the world. Those organizations that aren't technology organizations increasingly stand out and are going to struggle. And when we think about that, we have to consider the business models, because those are the things that influence behaviors and change lives. And while there's some potentially exciting technology in the future, currently we're in this lull between waves. Anybody telling you otherwise probably has something specific to sell you. So think about the platform that you're on. Are you building or are you busking? So I'll leave you with this little mantra that I used to have pinned above my desk when I worked at Xero. It's Cartoon by Hugh MacLeod. It's not what the software does, it's what the user does. And we could expand that, right, to be slightly broader. It's not what technology does, it's what people do with it that matters. What matters to us should be the practical uses of that technology by the people we care about, both the things that it enables and the things that it replaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. I was very fortunate when I first started at Sport New Zealand that Rowan was on our board, and he was that director that challenged in a different way, and it was incredibly valuable to me and to us as a board. He's, as you can see, a deep thinker about these things, but presents it in a way that everyone can grab hold of it and actually understand what's something that's incredibly complex and difficult in really simple ways. He's also a really incredible New Zealander. Not only was he one of the original founders of Trade Me, but he's also an angel investor now in lots of different organisations for people that are trying to get their vision off the ground, I suppose, and that's where we need people like Rowan to keep this country going. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, Rowan. It's great to see you and great to have you here.
Thanks, Rowan. Cheers. Thank you.